Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, happy Mother's Day. In the first service, one person was like, happy Mother... Wait, started to say it back to me. It's like, my mom was in the first service, and it's kind of fun. I get to do life with my mom, which is awesome. My mom lives a few blocks away from me, and my mom's pretty great. I think she's a pretty great lady. Still do after all these years. Like I'm a grown man, and I still think my mom is just pretty awesome. At one point, I tried to tell her she wasn't going to be my mom you're not my mom anymore. You can't tell me what to do. And here I am in my 40s, and she still can tell me what to do. She's still my mom. Like, moms can always be your mom. Like, that's just the way it goes. But my mom's she's a great person. If someone tries to ask me to describe my mom, that's difficult for me to do. Like, describing my mom, like someone saying, use some words that define who she is. If I try to describe my mom, it's like I find myself finding that the words are fairly incomplete. Like, they don't really cover, who she is. And I guess I feel that way about myself sometimes, that you take those personality tests and you have words that are supposed to identify who you are and your character and which one is more like you. And it's always whenever I pick a word for myself or anyone else, it never feels like it's complete, right? You go, well, that's true of me, but there's these other times when that's not true. Anyone identify with this? Words sometimes don't describe, a single word can't describe a person really well. And that's how I feel about my mom. I can try to describe in words, but if you really want to know my mom, you got to know some of the stories that I know, right? Which she's not in this service, so I can tell stories, right? As long as we keep it right here, she's not going to find out. So, when I was growing up, this is my mom. This is how these stories tell you a few things about my mom. When my mom used to buy Hostess ding dongs. And she made sure that when I came home from school, we had one together, a lot of days of the week. And I used to think that was for me. And then I realized at some point, no, she was doing that for us. That was the thing. So this is cool. So my mom, so you're oh, that's cool. She did that, right? But then we would take the foil when we were done and we'd ball it up. And we would chase each other around the house for 15 or 20 minutes, just beating each other with the foil from that. If my dad would have walked in, he'd have been like, son, you're disrespecting her. But, for us, it was just a game we played. We just had so much fun. My mom, when I was 15 years old, didn't have my permit. She's driving me to practice one day. She pulls over. I go, Mom, what are you doing? She goes, don't tell your dad, but I think it's time you learned how to drive. I'm like, yes, so here I am sitting behind the Buick, just driving down the road. My mom's like, okay, that just tells you about my mom. One time I walked in the room, my mom was folding laundry, and when I walked in, she was wearing a pair of my tighty-whities on her head, just calmly, oh, hey, what's up, so... I can keep telling stories. My mom, I tell you stories. The more stories I tell, the more you're going to get to know her, right? The more you know her. Because words don't describe her as much as the stories. Stories, they just do that. And probably also explains why I'm the way I am, the more I talk about my mom. But it's interesting because when we think about God, I think we have this tendency to try to define God with certain terms or theological paragraphs. When it comes to understanding who God is or telling people what God is like, or when we try to understand God, a lot of time what we try to do is exactly what we don't like being done for us or other human beings that we know. We want God to be defined in very concise, neat statements that we can wrap our mind around. We want to give a title or use a word and go, that's who God is, and then we just use this word. The reality is that for most of us, we get done describing God with terms or phrases or definitions, and it always leaves us the same way it leaves us when we describe a person with those things. A little short, a little flat. I think there's more to God than just omniscient. Oh, good, that's encouraging. What's that mean? What does it mean? And the truth is that the way we really understand God better is the same way we understand people. It's through stories. When we see stories, when we understand the stories of God, when we hear the stories of Him interacting with human beings and human beings interacting with Him, it's through those stories that we begin to understand God in all of His dimensions. And so the more stories that we hear, the more stories that we get to understand and unpack, the more we begin to understand God and all of His robustness, all the dimensions of who He is. The other side of that is actually just the opposite is true, and that's the fewer stories that we hear, the less that we understand, the less we listen to the stories of God, the less we know about who God really is. We only get to see one side of this incredibly complex person. So the importance of stories We can't highlight that enough, which is why we walk through this story of David's life. And I know for some of us, we look at the life of David, and we've been walking through this for months. I think there's this tendency to think, well, this is a really good study in David and who he is. And on some level, that's true. It's important to understand some of the events and personalities and things that take place. And yes, there are lessons to be learned in this. But ultimately, what we're understanding as we walk through the life of David, what we're looking at are stories about God. We might see the anatomy of a bad decision. We might learn how to confront people the way we're supposed to. We might learn these practical things, but in the context of all of it, as we walk through the life of David, what we're really looking at are stories about God, stories about who he is. And the more we see those stories, the more we unpack them, the more we know about him. We need to understand this. Like, I think about this for me, like at work, sometimes I can be fairly intense when I'm working. Like when you catch me in a work moment, Grant can attest to this because he saw a little bit of it this week. I can be intense. Some people call it a jerk. I can be intense sometimes though. Like I can be very driven. I'm very competitive. I can get very precise under pressure. That's kind of who I am, right? And you know that when I tell a story about being that sort of way. The other side of it, and some of you know this part of who I am, I can also be a clown and goof around and do all these other things, and people go, man, who is that guy? Does he ever take himself seriously? What's the deal, But if you're only getting one of those stories, one of you might say, wow, he's really intense. Other of you say, well, he never really settles down. He's just kind of hyper and kind of crazy all the time. Like, what's he doing? I tell a few more stories, you realize he really is crazy, right? You just keep trailing that down. But these stories unpack all of the dimension of who God is. And particularly this story that we're looking at this morning. The story that we're in right now, we started a few weeks ago, the story with David and Bathsheba and Nathan, the prophet, this story is showing us some of who we are, but this is showing us so much about God and who he is. Like we learn about him in this story. In fact, we learn things about his story or through this story that I think are really important based on our stories. Like in particular, this one that we're looking at. This story tells us some things about God that I think for most of us, with our stories being what they are, it's incredibly important to understand. I have some really great stories. Like I have good stories. I have adventures. I have thrills. I can make you laugh. I can tell you things. Like there are times people will be talking and telling a story, and I remember a story that I forgot. Like I've had enough life experiences that now I forget my good stories. I'm like, oh yeah, there's that story, and I can tell it. Like I have all these really good stories. I just want to tell you that. But I have some really bad stories. I have some really bad stories. I have mistakes that I've made. And I have things in my story that I'm ashamed of. There are things that I feel guilty for. There are things that I've said that I wish I never would have said. There are things that I've done that I really wish they weren't a part of my history. I wish that somehow I could get the eraser out and take those things out. Like, I have these things in my story. Like, I have these things that I've just done and I have trouble forgetting. I have some bad stuff in my story. Anyone else identify with this? Like, anyone want to tell their part of that story? We're all like, no. Like, we don't stand around parties and tell our bad stories. Oh, hey, this one time I was such a dirtbag, you wouldn't believe this, right? It is so great. You're going to think so much less of me when I'm done, right? Like, we don't tell those stories, and yet all of us have those stories. In fact, the reality of those stories existing, those things being in our lives, the times when we didn't listen and we just plowed through, the times when we did something and we didn't realize how significant the consequences would be, the things that we're still carrying, the things that honestly, for some of us in the room, they're the reason why today when someone talks about hope or when someone talks about restoration, those are the stories that make you think that couldn't be my story because this is so devastating, this was so bad that I could never overcome this. Like, these are the stories that we have, and yet those stories, the fact that we have that in our background, in our history, is what makes this particular story about David and Bathsheba and Nathan and all these things we're looking at, it's what makes this so important, because what we see in this story is something about God that's significant for us to understand as it relates to the stories that we don't want anyone to know. like the stuff that we don't want to ever parade in front of anyone. When you see this story and see who God is, it seriously changes and impacts how we view those things and how we view God. If you have your Bible, I want you to open up to Psalm chapter 51. Psalm chapter 51. We've been in 2 Samuel, and we're going to jump to Psalm 51, and we're going to be there. And before we actually start reading this, I just want to recap what's happening in David's story, because this is a circumstance that I think we need the full picture of. And so if you've missed anything in the process, I think it's good to catch this. It's also really good because we're going to look at the bad stuff that David did. And it's always easier to look at other people's mistakes than our own. So like after this moment of us all going, yeah, I've got stuff I don't want to tell. Now it's like, can we look at someone else? Because it'd be really good to look at someone else's mess up and not mine. So we're going to do that. We're going to look at David's mistake that he made in kind of a full spectrum. But here we have David, who is the king, right? King of Israel, this individual who is left with the responsibility of leading the people of God to live out the purposes of God in front of, before humanity. We have David. He's supposed to go off to war. He doesn't go off to war. He stays home. While he's staying home, David wanders up on the rooftop. And while he's wandering around his rooftop, he looks over at the neighbor's house and he sees his friend Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, and he lusts for her and desires her, and then he takes her, and then she gets pregnant. And in that middle of that pregnancy and the discovery of this, David realizes what he's done. He realizes and does what most of us do, and you realize, I've made some sort of mistake. I've got this thing I don't want anybody to know. I knew I shouldn't have done this. David hides this thing. He comes up with a plan. He'll have Uriah come back from the battlefield, her husband. Surely he'll come back, go home, and then after being gone for months, he'll lay with his wife, and then everyone will just assume that this child she's carrying was his from the time he came home. Problem was, Uriah comes home. He's such an honorable individual. He says, how in the world could I go back and engage my regular life when the men of Israel are off fighting on the battlefront? And so Uriah insists that he doesn't, and so now David is left with a situation where he's stuck. And so he comes up with another plan to cover his tracks. And the second plan is far more treacherous. David makes the decision to put Uriah at the front of the battlefield, put him in a situation where he would be intentionally in a position where he could be murdered or killed at war. And so David connives, he manipulates, he engages others in this process with him, and Uriah is dead. Uriah is killed because of David's deceit. David, everything seems to point is getting away with this. And then last week we saw that this situation happens. Nathan the prophet, Nathan, an individual who speaks on behalf of God, good friend of David's, comes to him, says, listen, there's a story I have to tell you. And the story that he tells him is about a rich man and a poor man. And he says, the rich man has all of these sheep. And the poor man, he just has one little ewe. By the way, every time I see you or hear the word or like read it on paper, I think of Jimmy Fallon. Ew. Ew. Some of you know this, right? Okay. Ew. So he has one little ewe, and then this guy has all the sheep, okay? And Nathan tells him the story. He says, David, this exists. This is going on. Like there's a situation where this rich guy has all these sheep, and this one guy, he's poor. He has nothing except this one little ewe. And this traveler comes from out of town. And the rich man, rather than kill or slaughter one of his own sheep, takes from the poor man who has nothing and slaughters that lamb and feeds the traveler. David hears the story. Hears Nathan tell this, and Grant walked us through this last week. David hears the story, and his response is immediate. This is an injustice. This is outlandish. I can't believe this is happening. And so David literally cries out like this man deserves to die. This man deserves to die. Like David hears about this story of a rich man that has everything, taking from the poor man who has nothing. And David's internal response to this is, somebody's got to do something about this, right? Like this guy needs to die because he cooked another guy's sheep. I love this part of this story because it shows us something about who we are. And I know this tells us a lot about who God is, and this story shows us a lot about his character, and it will. But this part right here shows some irony in who we are and how we respond. I mean, this is what's amazing. Even with these stories that we never want people to hear, even with the things that we would never want anybody to know, the times that we have just absolutely blown it, even with all of that kind of stuff down inside of us, we have the ability to become outraged at what other people are doing in their stories. Isn't that ironic? Like, here's David, and he is outraged. How dare you? How could anyone do this sort of thing? We tend to do the same. We have these stories inside of us, but we just shove them off into a corner, and then we respond to these things in others, and we go, I can't believe it. This is outlandish. Somebody should do something. You go on the news, look at the news, look at how we just feed off of media, the TV and the radio, and how we feed off of the things that people are doing, and oh, how could they, right? And we look down our noses at them, right? We become outraged. David hears this story, this injustice, and he's outraged. He's like, I'm going to write a blog about this, right? I'm going to make a Facebook post, and I'm going to let everybody that's my Facebook friend know how much I don't like this, right? Like, David's going to do something. This is horrible. Now, here's a question. At this point in the story, and David hears this, is he right? Absolutely. Is this horrible? Yes, it is horrible. But that's not the point of this. That's not the point of Nathan telling the story even. In fact, this shows us so much about God. Grant pointed this out last week. Nathan spins the whole thing around in this moment. He says, yeah, this is outlandish. Somebody should do something. This guy should die. And then Nathan looks at him and says, guess what? You're the individual I'm telling the story about. This is a story about you. This is your story. You're outraged at these improprieties in this other man's life, and yet it's the impropriety in your life that I'm telling you the story for. This is you. I want to remind you that this is Nathan the prophet who speaks on behalf of God, which means this. It means that not only what he's saying, but the way he's saying this tells us something about who God is. What does it tell us about God? What is this telling us about how God views us in our situations? Obviously, God cares about injustice, and he wants to solve the problems of the world. He wants to right the wrongs. He wants to undo the injustice. He wants those things to happen, but he wants it to be carried out in our lives first. The way Nathan is going about this speaks volumes that God is not looking for people to point fingers and cast judgment around the world, but God is looking to us and saying, do you see that story? That's your story. And the redemption, the restoration, the right being wronged starts with us. Jesus said, he who has no sin cast the first stone. And as quickly as we are able to see the sinfulness of others, God turns this thing around and says, this starts with you, with me. This is your story, David. That tells us something about God. He cares about what's going on inside of us. David, this is your story. This is how your life looks to me. And David just said, this man deserves to die. What do you do when you come to this place? Like, you come to this spot where you realize, like, look at my story. Like, when you look at those moments, and we've had those of us that raised our hand for the stories that we just keep hidden. When we have those moments, those incidents of brokenness and sinfulness, what do we do? It's interesting because David, throughout his life, when he was tuned into God, he wrote. He wrote psalms, he wrote poems, he wrote songs. And in this moment, in this period of his life, David writes a song, and that's what's recorded in Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is David amidst this moment of realizing who he is. It's David gushing himself out and saying, what do I do? This is David who's committed adultery, David who has murdered, David who has enlisted others. Like, you got to think about this. What we're seeing in David is this moment when he just said about a guy who cooked another man's sheep that he should die. We have David, who's the king of Israel, the king of the people of God, who's responsible for righting wrongs and solving injustice and being a light to the world. We have David, who's in charge of all of that, committing adultery and lying about it and murdering and involving others in this plot to cover up his actions. Like, we have David, so you imagine this moment of him realizing the gravity of his situation, right? Like, what am I doing? Like, what have I, like, it's this moment of, I don't want anybody to know this story. It's that moment when you think, if anyone heard about this, how could I even live with myself because of this thing that's going on? What does David do? He pleads with God. And his pleading shows us so much about who God is. Listen to this in Psalm chapter 51, verse 1. David says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me." Now, David just starts off, "Hey, have mercy on me, God." Like, this makes all the sense in the world. Have mercy on me, God. But I want to show you something about how he begins this that I think is really interesting. And there's a little bit of a mind bender in the middle of this. And I just want you to catch what happens here. Remember that David knows that he deserves to die. David, his first response was that this person needs to be taken care of, which for many of us, that's our default setting. Like, our default setting is to operate that way in our thinking towards God. Our thinking towards God functions really that we just kind of think of God like we're living life on the platform of this gigantic cosmic mousetrap, right? And just one false move, and God's just like, the spring is like tight, like he's just barely holding on. He's looking for any reason, right? Just to smack us down. Like, we live in that sort of place, right? So you come to this, and David has this, like, in fact, I'll just say this, like, we tend to blame every broken thing, every bad thing. Like, when this stuff happens, and this is the evidence of how we think, we tend to look at the circumstances of our life, and if they don't go according to plan, not all of us, but for many of us, our immediate response is to go back to God and say, "What did I do to deserve this?" And maybe not in a bitter sort of way, but maybe in a, "God, I probably deserved this. I probably deserved whatever thing went wrong in my day today. Like, God, what did I do?" Like, that's something that maybe we're mature enough to not admit that, but in our hearts, there's always that little part of us that's there that says, God must be angry, and it must be because of something that I did. Like, we operate in that sort of way. David starts out like we would start out. He says, "Have mercy." And that makes sense if you know that God is just waiting for a reason to smack you down, and you've just given him 7 or 8 really good reasons. But look at what David says next. He says, "Have mercy on me, O God." And then look at his perspective. "According to your steadfast love." He references this concept, this idea of God's love being this strong, unending, enduring love. Like, God, have mercy on me according to this abundant love. Like, that's, like, already this is kind of a little unusual when you think about it. Like, God, like, I would pray, like, "God, have mercy on me and don't smack me down even though I deserve it." And he says, "God, because you're so loving, have mercy on me." He says, "According to your abundant mercy," like, God, you continually extend mercy to people who don't deserve it. You're abundant in your mercy. Do you see that David's approaching this differently? He says, "Blot out the transgressions, wash me, cleanse me," right? Like, this thing that's got me so guilty, this thing I can't get over, this thing that's holding on to my life that it seems like it's never going to go away. David says, "God, would you wash this? Take this part of my story and change it. Like, do something about this." Why? I know what I've done. David says, "I can see it. I see who I am. I know who I am." But more importantly, what David is revealing in these verses is that he knows who God is. He understands who God is. Is David right about his condition? Yeah, he's right about his condition. But look at how he understands God to be. Steadfast love, abundant mercy, the one who can wash, the one who can cleanse, the one who can redeem this mess that I'm in. David runs to God out of desperation, not out of fear. David runs to God, and I think that's a huge difference. He runs to God out of desperation, looking for hope. He doesn't run to God out of fear, pleading with God to spare him in this moment. He isn't hoping to avoid the consequences for whatever thing he's done. He runs to God because he realizes that God is his only hope. That's it. He goes to God and he says, "God, you're my only hope. Only you in your love and mercy can bring me through this. Only you can do this." David sees this the way God sees it. He goes on in verse 4 and he says, "Against you You only have I sinned and done what's evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. He blamed his mom, by the way, not a popular thing to do on Mother's Day. But he's like, it's my mom's fault. She was a sinner, and so am I. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Like he acknowledges, God, you're God, I'm not God. I understand this. I see who you are. I know. And then he continues, and he basically says, God, do what you want. And look at verse 7. He says, purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. It's this idea of being relinquished from the bondage of the guilt and the shame. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. Do you see what David's saying to God? Like, wash me, cleanse me. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Do you ever feel like the things that are in your story ache? Don't they? There are things like those moments when something reminds you, there's a smell, there's a thought, there's a word, there's a moment, and you ache. And David knows this, and he says, God, restore these broken bones. Hide your face from my sins. Blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Do you understand what he's saying? Like, God, you do this for me, and I'll show other people who you are. Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. You know what's fascinating about this? David isn't praying for God to alter the consequences of what he's done. Isn't that interesting? David isn't saying, God, would you please erase this from my history? Could you just make this all undone? Could you make it go away? Could you snap your fingers? God, could you just change the consequences? Could you make sure that nothing bad happens to me because of this? David doesn't pray that. Nowhere is David praying that the consequences be removed. David is pleading for his heart to be changed, for life to be restored to him. That's what he wants. He wants the relationship. And he understands what God desires. Look at verse 16. He says, for you will not delight in sacrifice. Like if you were here for Easter, you know why David's saying this. Like, you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it to you. You will not be pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God. You will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices and burnt offerings and whole offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. David says, listen, you don't delight in sacrifices. Otherwise, I would do that. If that's what would do this, that's what I would do. That's not what you want. What you want is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. I look at this story and I just kind of wonder, why? Why does David pray this way? David has a radical, different orientation to God than somebody who's afraid or simply seeking to avoid punishment from God. Do you realize that? David prays this way. It flies in the face of this tendency that we have, this tendency of, I do good so God blesses. If I do bad, God punishes. Like, that's the way we tend to operate, and everything about what David's praying shows that he relates to God in a completely different sort of way. Do you understand this? Like, this is radical. So what happens for us is we go to God in prayer and we say, God, we plead with him, please don't spank me, right? Like, please. Like, I remember being a kid, one time my mom sent me in my room. Again, she's not here, so you can't rat me out on this, but my mom sends me to my room and she says, I'll be in there to deal with you in a little bit. And it was like a really long time. My mom's got a really good sense of humor. So I thought, if I can make her laugh when she walks in the room, maybe I can get out of this. And so I took all these pillows and I stacked them up on my butt. And I laid on the bed and I just waited, and I hear her coming down the hall with the wooden spoon on the paneling. Click, click. No, just kidding. Just kidding. She didn't do that. But she opens the door, and guess what? My mom bursts into laughter, right? She's just like, she laughs. Like, you're so funny. Now get those pillows off. Well, yeah, and takes it down, right? That's how we pray. Like we pray, we go to God, we go, God, you know what? I know that I blown it. I knew I messed it. Like, and I should be afraid of you. Like in that moment, like when we are face to face with the mistakes that we've made, our gut level response is to say, God, I'd do anything to make the consequences go away. Please don't spank me, right? We're hoping to manipulate an angry God by coming to him in prayer. But is that who God is? Is that the God that we're getting to know through these stories? Is this story showing us a God who's temperamental, a God who interacts this sort of way with his people? Is he unpredictable? Or is our God a redeemer? Which one is he? David is inviting God into the circumstances, into the moment of his life. He's inviting God not out of fear, but because God is his only hope, and he understands it. David prays this prayer, and he says, God, make my life whole again. Bring the joy back. And you're the only hope I have for this. If you wonder, how does David do this? Because I think this is the question. We see David respond in these sorts of ways, and you go, I can't believe he prays that, because that's not how I would be praying. I'd be praying, God, please don't strike me dead. How does David come to a place? How can David be so different? If you wonder that question, the good news is the guesswork in this story is taken out of it. How could David write with this perspective? How could David be so different that instead of approaching God out of fear, he's actually approaching God because he realizes God's his only hope? How does that happen to somebody? This is an important thing for us to understand. This is fundamental to us relating to God correctly. Here's how David does it. Psalm 51 isn't written in the middle of Nathan confronting David. Psalm 51 is written after the circumstances have taken place. So this isn't the prayer that David prayed. Like David didn't just suddenly write this song. Like, Nathan, could you hold on real quick? I want to write this, then we'll see what the outcome is. David writes this after the fact. Nathan comes, he tells him the story. David reacts and says, somebody needs to die. And then Nathan says, that person's you. You're the one that needs to die. And so David's in this moment of, then I should die. Like, if that's the case, that's what should happen. And so David's response, actually David's first response was exactly what our response is. When he was faced with the reality of what he was done, he actually realized, this is me, this is my head, I should die. Like, that's David's initial reaction. He assumed that God's just like us. And if you mess with me, I'm going to mess with you. And God, I've messed with you, and now you're going to mess with me. He assumed that God operates on that same level that we do. So how was David able to go from a place of assuming the worst to appealing to God for his mercy and love? Look at what happened in the story in 2 Samuel 12. As soon as David uttered the words to Nathan, remember, Nathan is speaking on behalf of God. Look at what is said. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. In other words, I deserve to die. And Nathan said to David, in other words, God's words to David in the immediate moment when he said, I've blown it, God's words were, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Do you understand the significance of this? Like David says, this is what I deserve. And Nathan, before he can even say another word, I know, but that's not what God wants for you. Like the moment he's faced with his brokenness, his sinfulness, the moment that he's in this situation, Nathan says, the Lord has taken away your sin and you're not going to die. Like, I know you recognize it. That's a great thing to recognize and realize, really important in this process. But the moment you realize it, the first thing you hear is, you're forgiven. You're forgiven. How does think about this. How does a person go from living in fear to inviting God to create new life out of brokenness? How does that take place? How's that possible? Forgiveness, right? That's what transforms David. That's what transforms us. The moment that David sees his error, he's told of God's forgiveness. Like, David, you got it. You're right. You understand. But God is not who you think he is. And so David appeals And this realization of forgiveness, this realization of God's mercy turns to a prayer, a song, a poem in which David says, if you can forgive me, then I want you to be all over this life of mine. I don't want to live in fear of you. I want to live with you as a part of this. If you have the ability to forgive this, then you're the only one that can actually bring life out of this mess. Let me ask you this question. What's more motivating, fear or love? Every mom will say fear works for a season, right? It can be very motivating for a while, and don't forget that. But at some point, we realize that the only thing that truly motivates is love. And so what does God communicate to us? Do you think the God of the universe who holds out great hope for humanity, do you think that God's primary method, do you think God, who is far more wise than you and I, do you think God is still resorting to using fear to create transformation in our lives? Or could it be that God is using love and that he expresses his forgiveness and his grace because he holds out great hope for us, because he can bring life out of death, because he can take this situation that's broken and fix it in a way that we never, he knows this. He has the power to change things. God's got a different way of operating. And if you're living in this position of constant fearfulness, a story like this tells us so much about who God is. There's a moment a few verses down, and let me just say the consequences and circumstances for David don't immediately lift or get better. The child that he and Bathsheba have together actually dies. And there's this horrible grieving that takes place in David's life, this pleading outside of Psalm 51, where he's just wrecked in the reality of what's gone on. And then towards the end of 2 Samuel chapter 12, in a summary, there's something that's said. And when I first read this months ago, it was the reason I wanted to talk about this, because it was just said so simply, and yet it's so powerful. But in verse 24, it says that David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went in to her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. Solomon. David and Bathsheba have Solomon, the most wise human being to ever live and walk the planet. The son of David who would build the temple that David had wanted to build, but God said no. Solomon, who would now be in the lineage of Jesus as he traced his family back to David. David and Bathsheba have Solomon. If you didn't already know this, you guys know that David had some other wives. That's a whole nother thing we'll get into sometime. But what does it tell you that somewhere in the summary of what's taken place in this story is this moment that God chooses this relationship? Like the one where there was the most destruction, the one where things had just crumbled and fallen apart, the one that we all would have just written out and said, there's no hope for this. What does it tell you about God that it's out of David and Bathsheba that Solomon is born? Doesn't that tell you something about who God is? I have this friend that a few years ago, he was pastoring a large church, and he made the decision to move from that church to another church. He and his family prayed about it. It was like, one really big church to another really, really big church, like huge, massive, like 12,000 people go to it. A nightmare for someone like me, but he liked it. So he prayed for months and months. I remember him asking me, hey, what do you think I should do? And I said, you're crazy. And no one would wish that upon themselves. But they made the decision to do that. Last Sunday at his existing church, standing in front of thousands of people, he says goodbye. Never going to be your pastor again. I'm moving to this other place. While that was going on, his kids found out via some text messages and looking at his wife's phone that for 3 years she'd been having an affair with somebody who was related to a staff member, who was their closest friends, whose son was his son's best friend, and had been hiding it all this time. he immediately drove to the guy's house and tried to kill him, literally. Had to be held back, was bashing his head against the bedpost. His life completely unravels. Remember at one point he said to me, I don't even know what I'm going to do. Like I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, I think I'm going to go work at McDonald's, and that's what I'll do the rest of my life. Like for him, life had just blown apart. Everything for years was suddenly woven with this deception. And at some point in the process of dealing with this, he felt like the Lord said to him, kind of whispered in his ear, when he was asking, what should I do with her? The Lord said, how would you think I would want you to treat my daughter? And it just wrecked him because he knew what he needed to do. And so he makes this decision to stay with her. But as far as he's concerned, life is over. Like their life was a mess. It was gossip column worthy on every level. And after months of floundering, he was sitting with his son, and his son just looked at him and he said, Dad, what are we going to do? And he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he said, well, Dad, this move that we were going to make, we prayed about it. Like we prayed, and we heard God say yes, and we knew like months and months and months, as a whole family, we knew we needed to do this. We knew this was a part of what we needed to do. And he said, yeah, man, but that's all off. Like now it's like there's no way. Like that whole thing, like no one would take me. We'll never be whole. This is never going to happen. Like that can't happen. And his 13-year-old son looks at him and he says, Dad, don't you think that God knew what Mom was doing when he told us what to do next? As my friend was sharing that with me, I just broke down and he broke down, and just the reality of understanding that in the middle of our messes, God's at work. Do you understand the power of that? Like, in the middle of our messes, that 13-year-old boy had the wisdom to say, Dad, God knew what Mom was doing. It doesn't change the outcome. Like, God works in the middle of the messes. And I don't know what your messes are. I don't know what your stories are. I don't know what the things are that you don't want anybody to know, and maybe you don't want to repeat them or talk about them or whatever, but can I just say this to you? Our Redeemer, our God, isn't looking to smack down on you. He's looking to redeem you. He's looking to show you love and grace and hope, and he's wooing you with love, and he's saying, can we do something amazing together? That's what this story tells us about God. That's why we need to see these stories, because this tells us something that so many times we don't even think about. And yet when I see God for who he is, I can't help but say, come, please, create in me a clean heart. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. Take the brokenness, the shame, the guilt, eradicate it, wash me clean, and bring new life to this.